Hey everyone, it's Joanne Molinaro, the Korean Vegan, and today I'm going to show you how to make tofu two ways. We're going to make some stir-fried tofu noodles as well as some kimchi silken tofu hot pot. Both delicious, both so satisfying. This is going to be a story time video, but as with my previous story time videos, you'll find links to the full recipes in the description below. So let's get to it and start eating some tofu. So lately, I have been thinking about my grandmother a lot. My grandmother on my mother's side, specifically my 외할머니, as it's called in Korean. And this morning, I was thinking about one of my favorite stories about my grandmother, and it's about how she saved my life. That's right. When I was a little girl, 2 years old, my mom took me with her on a particularly gray, rainy, damp day to run some errands. You know, grocery shopping, picking up a few things from the local store, all that stuff. That's usually what young parents do. They can't afford daycare or babysitters, so they bring their infant or toddler along with them on their daily activities. My mom was no different. So I joined her that day. And when we returned, she noticed that I was a little bit tired. So she put me down for a nap. And later that evening, she noticed that I was back to full energy and thought nothing of it. I then fell back asleep later that night after a very long night of trying to coax me back to sleep. I'm sure there are a lot of mothers who are listening right now who can relate to the struggle of putting a unhappy toddler to bed. According to my mom, she held me in her arms all night long until around 5 or 6 in the morning when I finally went kaput and fell asleep. So, needless to say, my mom was in no rush to rouse me from my slumber throughout the day. Later that afternoon, though, she noticed that I had a fever. Again, thinking nothing of it, many toddlers come down with fevers or colds. She made an appointment with my pediatrician. But as is often the case, you can't just get in to see your pediatrician that same day. You often have to wait a few days to get to see your doctor. My mom didn't panic. She didn't think I had, a serious illness or anything. I probably just had a, common cold or something to that effect. She did notice that I wasn't getting up, though. But again, she was happy to have me sleeping after pretty much pulling an all-nighter to put me to bed. My grandmother, who was living with us at the time, however, had very different thoughts on what was happening. She kept pestering my mom about seeing the doctor as soon as possible and taking me to the hospital. Now, as it were, my mother was a nurse at that time. She was a nurse for 40 years. She was a young nurse at that time, but she still believed that she knew a little bit more about health than my grandmother. She was certain she knew a lot more about the American medical system than my recently immigrated grandmother, and made no bones about explaining to my grandmother, Mom, you can't just, go in and see the doctor whenever you feel like it. You have to make an appointment, and you often have to take several days to go in to see your doctor. So that's what she explained to my grandmother. My grandmother continued to bother my mother and said, no, you got to take this girl to the hospital. You got to take her right now. And my mom kept, pushing back and resisting and saying, well, I'm sure it's nothing. I don't want to make a big deal out of nothing. I don't want to cause a kerfuffle over a common cold. Finally, when I still hadn't woken up, my grandmother said this to my mother very clearly. Sonny, if you don't take this girl to the hospital right now, she is going to die. Now, my mom, she finally gave up. She couldn't resist any longer, especially after a warning like that. So in lieu of waiting to take me in to see my pediatrician, my mother carted me in her arms to the emergency room of the hospital. And within short order, they determined that I was actually in a coma. It wasn't just a very heavy nap, and that in fact my common cold wasn't a common cold at all. After doing a quick spinal tap, they determined that I had meningitis. And just as my grandmother had predicted, my physician confirmed that had my mother waited even just a few hours, I would have probably been blind, deaf, or even killed. And that is how my grandmother saved my life. My mother often tells me that the happiest day of her life was the day I woke up from my coma, and the first word out of my mouth was "Mommy!" When I think about that story, it reminds me so much of sort of the disconnect that kids often have from their immigrant parents. So even my mother, who was herself an immigrant, thought she knew better because she was more accustomed to and acquainted with the American way of doing things, and therefore pushed back against my grandmother's advice about visiting the hospital because she was like, well, that's not how it's done here in the United States. And that certainly played the same role in my own relationship with my mother growing up, which was, well, no, you can't go to school looking like that. That's not how kids go to school in the United States. Or no, Amma, you need to sign this permission slip right now without even reading it because I need to go to this field trip. That's the way it's done in the United States. And then more recently, just kind of talking to her about, my job or how things work at the office. No, Amma, I can't just say things like that to my colleagues because that's not how it's done in the United States. And how quickly we try to use our acculturation or assimilation as an excuse for dismissing what is oftentimes universally good advice. I remember about 4 months before my first wedding, both my parents tried to convince me not to go through with the wedding. They had some very strong but compassionate advice about what was in my best interest when it came to my love life. And once again, I thought to myself, wow, this is such a Korean way of thinking. They don't understand that in America, you marry for love, and love is enough. You don't need anything other than love in order to successfully have a good marriage. Ultimately, about 9 years later, I divorced my ex-husband. And in retrospect, I realize now that their advice, whether it comes from Korean parents or American parents, was just parental advice. They just wanted what was best for their daughter, and they were worried for her safety and for her happiness. And I wish that I had viewed that advice without any sort of prejudice against them because of where it was coming from. For me, that's the ultimate takeaway from this story about my grandmother as she saved my life, and even more recently as my parents tried to save me from what was ultimately a debacle of a marriage. If the advice is being given out of love, then there's nothing lost by listening to the advice in the spirit of love. In the end, it's far less important whether or not you followed that advice than whether you considered that advice with an open heart. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this storytime video. If you did, make sure to hit that like button and make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future Korean vegan videos. Have a lovely day.